Among 43 new residents rotating through Hargrove Regional that Monday, only one paused outside the supply room where Patrick Dunn was restocking IV bags and asked, "Do you need someone to hold the door?" She had no idea she had just offered kindness to the man who owned the hospital. Not managed, not directed, owned. Patrick Dunn was 41 years old, the sole principal of Dunn Health Group, a private healthcare company operating 11 hospitals across Ontario and British Columbia. His face had appeared on the cover of Canadian Business twice in 3 years. His name appeared on the building outside, though the letters were small and most people walked past them without reading. Inside Hargrove Regional, no one on the resident rotation would have recognized him. The acquisition had closed 6 weeks ago. He had not yet held a public introduction, and the man standing in the supply corridor that Monday morning was wearing navy scrubs, a facilities badge that read Owen Park, and a pair of scuffed work boots he had bought specifically for the occasion. He had not planned to deceive anyone longer than necessary. He had planned to observe. The letter that made him do it had arrived 9 days earlier, slipped into a plain envelope with no return address, forwarded through 3 layers of administrative handling before someone decided it was urgent enough to reach him. It was written on lined notebook paper in small, careful handwriting. "Mr. Dunn, I don't expect you to read this. I don't even know if it gets to you. But I've worked in your hospital for 6 years, and I don't think the people making decisions here know what it actually feels like to work here. Not anymore. Maybe they never did." The letter went on for 2 pages. The writer described charge nurses dismissing orderly concerns without reading them, residents being coached to avoid certain departments because the attending physicians in those departments were difficult, which meant they asked hard questions about patient load, a cleaning staff rotation so short that rooms were being turned in 11 minutes instead of the required 20, and the numbers being entered as 20 anyway. A formal complaint that had been filed 8 months ago by a porter named George Arsenault, and had, as far as anyone could tell, simply stopped existing somewhere inside the HR system. The letter was unsigned, but at the bottom, in smaller letters, was one more line. "This place still saves lives, but I don't know how much longer the people saving them can hold on." Patrick had read it twice standing at his desk in Toronto, then called his operations director, who assured him it was an isolated concern, probably from someone dealing with a personal grievance, and that Hargrove's satisfaction scores were within target range. He had thanked her, hung up, and booked a flight to Thunder Bay the following Sunday. He had not told anyone where he was going or why. He had told his assistant he needed a week with limited availability. He had borrowed a set of scrubs from a friend who ran a clinic, created a temporary facilities badge through a contractor account that predated the acquisition, and arrived at Hargrove Regional at 6:45 on Monday morning, pushing a linen cart he had checked out from the basement without anyone asking his name. By 6:50, he understood the first thing the letter had been trying to tell him. The hallways in this hospital were not broken. They were exhausted. He could see it in small things. A charge nurse who had been awake since the previous afternoon, still carrying her clipboard with the same grip she probably used when everything felt urgent at the start. A porter named Trevor, who nodded good morning to Patrick, without breaking stride, not unfriendly, just running the kind of math in his head that people run when they know exactly how many things need to happen before 9 a.m. and exactly how little time there is to do them. Patrick kept his head down and pushed his cart. The new resident rotation assembled outside the third-floor education room at 8 o'clock. 43 people in clean white coats, carrying the specific kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you are finally somewhere that matters and being terrified of doing it wrong. Patrick was restocking the supply room 15 feet down the hall when she appeared in his peripheral vision. She was shorter than most of the group, standing slightly apart from the main cluster, reading something on her phone with a small crease between her eyebrows that suggested she was reviewing something she wanted to memorize. Her coat was pressed carefully but not new. Her stethoscope looked like it had been used in a previous life. When the group began moving toward the education room, she noticed Patrick before anyone else had glanced in his direction. She stepped back, held the supply room door with one hand, and said it simply. No performance in it, no delay while she calculated whether it was worth her time. Do you need someone to hold the door? Patrick looked at her name badge, Dr. Hazel Morrow, PGY1, University of Manitoba. I've got it, he said. Thank you. She smiled once, not the practiced kind, and went inside. Patrick let the door close behind him and stood in the supply room for a moment with his hand resting on the edge of a shelf. He could hear faintly the orientation session beginning. A hospital administrator named Carolyn Frick was welcoming the new cohort in the voice of someone who had given this speech many times and had made peace with giving it many more. Respect, collaboration, excellence, the three words that appeared on the third slide of every orientation deck Patrick had ever seen. He finished restocking the shelf and went back into the hallway. By 10 o'clock, he had learned the second thing the letter had been trying to tell him. It was not one bad decision. It was 100 small permissions. A resident in a wool blazer, the kind that cost more than a first-year resident's monthly loan repayment, stepped around Patrick's cart without acknowledgement. Not rude exactly, just absent. The way you walk around a fire hydrant. Patrick was furniture in that resident's morning. A department coordinator dropped a binder on the nursing station counter while on the phone and walked away from it. The binder slid off the edge. Patrick caught it before it hit the floor. The coordinator was already through the door. In the break room that served the third and fourth floor staff, someone had left a coffee spill on the counter from what Patrick estimated was the previous shift. Everyone who came in saw it. Everyone who came in went around it. Then at 11:15, Dr. Hazel Morrow came into the break room and wiped it up herself. She did not look around to see if anyone was watching. She did not sigh loudly. She found a paper towel, cleaned the counter, threw the towel away, and poured her coffee. Patrick was refilling the paper towel dispenser in the corner and said nothing. She noticed him on her way out. The dispenser by the sink was empty too, she said. I was going to mention it to someone. I'll get it, Patrick said. Thank you. She paused at the door. Do they have you covering the whole floor or? Just where it needs doing. She nodded, accepted that, and left. He watched the door swing closed. There were 42 other residents on that rotation. In 2 hours, not one of them had spoken to him as though he were a person running a thought in his head. Hazel Morrow had done it twice. He went to get the other dispenser. The thing about Hazel Morrow was that she was not a saint. Patrick understood that quickly. She made mistakes in those first 2 days. She second-guessed herself out loud once in a way that a senior resident named Dr. Troy Bassett noticed and filed away with the particular efficiency of someone building a case. She missed a reference in a case discussion that she clearly knew and simply could not retrieve fast enough under pressure. She spent too long on a patient interaction and had to run to catch the attending's rounds, arriving slightly breathless and slightly flushed while Bassett arrived, looking like he had never moved faster than a comfortable walk in his life. But she also did something Patrick had not seen from anyone else that week. On Tuesday afternoon, she stopped to speak to George Arsenault. George was 57, a porter who had worked at Hargrove for 14 years. He was quiet in the specific way of someone who has learned that speaking up produces more paperwork than results. Patrick had noticed him on the first day. He moved through the hospital with the efficiency of someone who knew every shortcut and the wariness of someone who had stopped expecting to be thanked for knowing them. Hazel stopped him near the elevator with a patient chart tucked under her arm. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm new here. I'm trying to figure out the fastest way to get a patient from radiology to the cardiac unit in a chair rather than a bed, if the patient is ambulatory but fatigued. Is there a route that avoids the main corridor backup?" George looked at her for a moment. Patrick, folding linen 6 feet away, watched without appearing to watch. "Service elevator," George said finally. "East side. Takes you up to 4, then the connecting corridor. Saves about 8 minutes if the main hall is backed up after 2 p.m. 8 minutes, Hazel said. That matters. It does, George said. He sounded mildly surprised that she'd said so. Thank you. I'm Dr. Morrow. I'll probably ask you something else I should know by the end of the week. George almost smiled. I'll be around. She went back to her chart. George went back to his cart. Patrick kept folding. She was not performing kindness. She was doing the thing that should have been ordinary and had somehow become uncommon. She noticed the people the system had taught everyone else to look through. That was what unsettled him, not because it was extraordinary, because it wasn't or shouldn't have been. Wednesday brought the assessment. Dr. Carolyn Frick announced it in the morning briefing. Each resident team would review a real patient case from the past quarter and present a systems-level recommendation to department leadership by Friday. The goal, Carolyn said, was to evaluate diagnostic thinking and communication under pressure. Troy Bassett accepted the role of team lead for Group 2 before anyone had the chance to suggest otherwise. He had a way of moving into authority the way water moves into a low space, not forceful, just inevitable, and complete before you noticed it happening. Hazel was in Group 2. By Wednesday afternoon, Patrick was spending more time near the Group 2 workspace than his linen cart strictly required. What he watched was this. Hazel had identified something in the patient data that the others had missed, a pattern in the readmission numbers that pointed not to the patient's conditions but to a discharge protocol that consistently underestimated recovery time for patients over 70 who lived alone. These patients were being sent home with follow-up windows that were too long given their actual support situations. They were coming back within 10 days, not because of clinical failure, but because the discharge process had been optimized for efficiency on paper, and for human reality, not at all. She explained it clearly to her group. Troy listened with the particular attentiveness of someone cataloging what they can use. "That's a strong observation," he said. "Very grounded. We can build the framework around it." Hazel looked relieved. "I can write up the data section." "I'll handle the structure," Troy said. "You've got the field instinct. I'll make sure it reads at the right level for leadership." The phrase stayed with Patrick all evening, "reads at the right level." He found out what it meant on Thursday morning when Hazel opened the shared document from her laptop in the resident lounge and went very still. Her analysis was there. Every observation, every data point, every recommendation about discharge windows and follow-up timelines, it was all there. Under Troy Bassett's name. Her contribution had been moved to a subsection at the bottom titled Supporting Clinical Notes. Her name appeared once in that section. Troy's name appeared 4 times in the body of the proposal. Patrick was retrieving a towel cart from the supply closet at the end of the hall and could not hear what she said when Troy arrived 20 minutes later, but he could see the exchange through the glass partition. The way Hazel's posture changed when she showed him the document. The way Troy's expression did not change at all, which was its own kind of answer. The way she left the conversation 2 minutes later with her coffee cup held slightly too tightly, and her eyes looking at a point about 6 inches in front of her feet. He left his cart in the hallway and went to get a coffee he did not need. She was standing by the window at the end of the resident lounge when he walked past, not crying, not composing herself for the benefit of anyone passing, just standing in the particular stillness of someone who has just had something confirmed that they had been hoping was not true. "You all right?" Patrick said. She looked at him, then she gave a short, dry sound that was not quite a laugh. "I'm figuring out how things work here," she said. Patrick stood with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he hadn't poured yet. "Does figuring it out feel the way you expected it to?" Hazel looked at the window. Outside, Thunder Bay was doing the thing it does in November, which is to say it was gray in a way that committed fully to the concept. "I spent 4 years of medical school and 2 years of residency learning to see what other people miss," she said. "I'm good at it. I know I'm good at it." She paused. "And I just found out that being good at it mostly means I'm useful to people who are better at the other thing." "What other thing?" "Taking up the right amount of space," she said. "Saying the right words to the right people. Making the work look like it came from someone else." Patrick said nothing for a moment. "Don't let this place convince you that knowing how to disappear is the same as being professional," he said. She looked at him again, and it was a different kind of looking than before. The way you look at someone when something they've said has landed somewhere specific. "Owen," she said, reading his badge, "were you ever in a different kind of work?" Patrick kept his eyes on the window. "I've been responsible for how a lot of people spent their days," he said carefully, "and I didn't always know what those days actually felt like until it was later than it should have been." Hazel was quiet for a moment. That's an interesting thing for a facilities worker to say. It's an interesting building, Patrick said. He picked up his cart and went back down the hall. Thursday evening brought a reception. It was held in the hospital's administrative wing, a space that had clearly been designed to look warmer than a hospital, without committing to anything so impractical as comfort. There were wine options in 2 colors, a cheese board that had been assembled by someone who understood cheese theoretically, and 43 new residents trying to look like they belonged in a room full of people who had been deciding things for decades. Patrick was there in his facilities capacity, managing the service cart near the side wall, which put him in the position of seeing nearly everything without being visible to almost anyone. Troy Bassett was in the center of the room within 15 minutes, standing with Dr. Carolyn Frick and a senior administrator named Arthur Doyle, who Patrick knew from the acquisition process as someone who was excellent at identifying which way a conversation was going and positioning himself accordingly. Patrick heard fragments. The discharge pattern analysis in our proposal really came together, Troy said. Systemic thinking at a pretty high level, I think. Arthur nodded. Where did the data framing come from? Troy's smile did not change. Team effort. I tried to give it the right shape for leadership review. Hazel was near the window with a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, watching the same conversation from a different angle. Patrick watched her decide something. He could see it in the shift of her weight, the small straightening of her posture. She crossed the room. The discharge pattern analysis, she said, stepping into the circle with a steadiness that cost her something, started with patient readmission data I pulled on Tuesday. The pattern in the over 70 cohort, the follow-up window problem, the systemic gap between clinical efficiency and patient reality, those were my observations. Arthur looked at her with the mild interest of someone who has seen this kind of thing before and is curious which way it goes. Troy's smile held, but it cooled by 1 degree. Hazel contributed important groundwork, he said. I synthesized it into a leadership-ready framework. Synthesized, Hazel said. Is that what it's called when someone's name gets moved to the footnotes? The circle went quiet, not dramatically. The way a room goes quiet when something true has been said and everyone is deciding at the same moment whether to acknowledge it. Carolyn Frick had been listening from 2 feet away. She stepped forward. Dr. Morrow, she said, with the specific gentleness that is a warning in formal clothing, this is a collegial event. Perhaps we table attribution questions for a more appropriate setting. I'm not being uncollegial, Hazel said. Her voice was steady in a way that Patrick suspected was costing her quite a lot. I'm asking a factual question about a document with my name removed from sections I wrote. Leadership presence, Carolyn said quietly, includes knowing when a setting is appropriate for escalation. There it was, the invisible label, too reactive, doesn't read the room, not quite the right fit. Patrick set down the tray he was holding. He walked across the room. He stopped beside Hazel. Mr. Doyle, he said. Arthur Doyle looked at him with the expression of a man who has just been addressed by a piece of furniture. I'm afraid I'm not, Arthur began. My name is Patrick Dunn, Patrick said. I'm the principal of Dunn Health Group. I've been in this building since Monday. The room did not go silent so much as it held its breath. Carolyn Frick's face underwent a series of rapid adjustments. Troy Bassett's did not. He had gone completely still, which was its own kind of answer. Patrick looked at Carolyn. Dr. Morrow asked a factual question. I'd like to hear the answer. There was no answer. He looked at Arthur. Tomorrow morning, I'd like you to set up a meeting with the department heads and the HR director. I'll need access to the incident reporting system going back 18 months. I'm specifically interested in a complaint filed by a porter named George Arsenault. He paused. And I'd like it noted in whatever system you use for these things that Dr. Morrow raised a legitimate concern in a professional setting and was told that the problem was her timing. He turned back to the room. I came here this week because someone sent me a letter about what this hospital feels like from the inside, he said. Not from a boardroom, from the inside. He looked at the residents, the administrators, the attending physicians who had been holding their drinks and watching this happen. I found a cleaning staff rotation that is falsifying completion times because they don't have enough people to do the job properly. I found a formal complaint from a 14-year employee that appears to have been filed and ignored. I found a culture in which the people who do the most essential work are systematically treated as though they are not people doing work, but background conditions. He paused, and I found one resident who spoke to the porter, wiped up the coffee spill no one else touched, held the door for someone carrying a linen cart, and then had her name removed from her own analysis. He looked at Troy. Ambition is a reasonable thing, Patrick said. Using other people's work to get there is not ambition, it's subtraction. Troy said nothing. Patrick turned to Hazel. Dr. Morrow, would you be willing to present your analysis tomorrow morning? Your analysis, to the leadership team. Hazel looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. She said it quietly, but she said it without flinching. Friday morning, Hazel Morrow stood at the front of a conference room that had been arranged with more care than it usually received, because the principal of Dunn Health Group was sitting at the table, and people had apparently been notified overnight. She presented for 22 minutes. She explained the readmission pattern. She walked through the discharge protocol gap. She showed the data on the over 70 cohort and the specific follow-up window problem. She explained what George Arsenault had told her about the East Elevator and why that kind of knowledge, held by the people who move through the hospital all day, was systematically excluded from the rooms where decisions were made. She was not perfect. She moved past one slide too quickly. She used a phrase she clearly wished she hadn't and visibly corrected herself. Her hands were still for most of it, but not at the beginning. She was real. That was the thing. She was a person standing in a room full of people and telling them something true, and it showed. When she finished, the first question came from the department head of internal medicine, who wanted to know how she had identified the over 70 cohort pattern. I noticed that the patients coming back within 10 days were predominantly from that group, Hazel said, and then I asked George Arsenault which patient rooms he saw family members leaving from in the evenings. He knew immediately. He'd watched it for years. The department head wrote something down. Patrick said nothing. He had promised himself he would not speak until she was finished, and she was finished, so he stayed quiet and let the room do what rooms do when someone has just said something worth listening to. George Arsenault was offered a formal consultation role in patient experience review before the end of the following week. He accepted it after asking twice whether it was real and being told twice that it was. The cleaning staff rotation was rebuilt over the following month. The falsified completion times stopped because the staffing levels were corrected to the point where falsification was no longer a survival strategy. Troy Bassett left the program. There was no announcement, only an absence, and then the quiet understanding that the absence was not going to be explained. Carolyn Frick remained. Patrick felt, after some consideration, that removal was not the right response to every failure of judgment. What he asked for instead was a meeting, a conversation about what leadership culture actually meant in a building where the person who knew the fastest route to cardiac was a porter who had been ignored for 8 months. Carolyn listened with the expression of someone absorbing something they cannot entirely disagree with. It was a start. The letter writer was never identified. Patrick left that alone. Whoever they were, they had said what needed saying and had trusted, without much evidence of reason to, that it would reach someone who would do something with it. That seemed like enough. Hazel Morrow completed her rotation at Hargrove Regional and was offered a position in the Internal Medicine Fellowship Program in the spring. She took it. She did not take it because of Patrick Dunn. She took it because it was the right next step, and because the department head of internal medicine had, during the 2 weeks following the Friday presentation, started sending her papers he thought she might find useful. That was how those things worked when they worked correctly. What changed between Patrick and Hazel changed slowly. The way things change when both people involved are cautious about power and aware of how easily it distorts the space between people. It started with a conversation in the hospital cafeteria on the last day of his time in Thunder Bay. Patrick had gone to say goodbye in some form and found her at a corner table with a coffee and a patient file, and they talked for 40 minutes about the discharge protocol recommendations, and then, gradually, about other things. He told her about the acquisition, about the letter, about standing in the supply room on Monday morning, and understanding within the first hour that the satisfaction scores his operations director had cited were a description of a different hospital than the one he was standing in. She told him about Manitoba, about the particular experience of being the first in her family to finish a university degree and then a medical degree, and how that had not simplified her relationship with institutions so much as made it more precise. She knew exactly what it cost to be in a room, and what it cost to be excluded from one. When he left that afternoon, he thought about the moment on Monday when she had held the door, how small it was, how she had not calculated it. He thought about the letter on lined notebook paper and the person who had trusted, without any particular reason to, that the truth would get somewhere useful if they sent it. He thought about George Arsenault knowing the fastest route and keeping that knowledge private for years because no one had thought to ask. He called his operations director from the airport. "I need you to build something into the quarterly review process," he said. "Not a survey, an actual conversation. Every facility, every level of staff, someone sits down with the porters, the cleaning teams, the people running the service elevators, not HR, someone with actual decision-making authority, and they ask what the building feels like from where those people are standing." His operations director was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant time investment." "It is," Patrick said. "Do it anyway." He hung up and looked out at the tarmac. Months later, he was in Thunder Bay again for a different reason, and Hazel met him for dinner near the waterfront, and they sat across from each other without the hospital between them for the first time, and it was easier than either of them had expected and harder in different ways. And they stayed long enough that the restaurant began putting chairs on tables around them, and neither of them noticed until a server mentioned it apologetically. He had spent years being untouchable by design, believing that distance was what allowed him to see clearly. What he understood now, sitting in a restaurant in November with the sound of Lake Superior somewhere in the dark outside, was that he had been seeing the shape of things from very far away. She had been seeing them up close the whole time. That was the difference. That was what the letter had been trying to tell him, and what the week in Scrubs had finally let him understand, that the most important information in any building is held by the people who are trusted with the least of it. He reached across the table. She looked at his hand, then at him, and she did not calculate it. She took it. "I keep thinking about the door. Not the boardroom door, not the one Patrick Dunn eventually walked through to reveal who he was, the supply room door. The one Hazel Morrow held open on a Monday morning for a man she thought was a facilities worker, before she knew anything about him, before there was any reason at all to be kind except that it was the right thing to do in that moment, and she did it without thinking. That's the part that stays with me. We talk a lot about integrity as though it's something you perform when people are watching, but what Hazel showed quietly, repeatedly, across a week where she had every reason to be focused entirely on her own survival in a competitive program, was something closer to the real thing. She wiped up a coffee spill no one else touched. She asked George Arsenault which route saved 8 minutes, and then she told him those 8 minutes mattered. She picked up her own mess at the end of a long day. None of it was calculated. That was precisely the point. And because she operated that way, she saw things others missed. The read mission pattern in the over 70 cohort didn't come to her because she was brilliant in isolation. It came to her because she was paying attention to people the system had trained everyone else to overlook. Good character and clear thinking aren't separate qualities in people like Hazel. They come from the same place. When you actually see the people around you, you understand problems more completely. When you don't, you produce beautiful slide decks that describe a different hospital than the one you're standing in. Troy Bassett was not unintelligent. That's what makes his part of the story worth sitting with. He understood how rooms work, how credit accumulates, how to position himself beside the right people at the right moment. He had every tool except the one that would have made all the others worth something. And when the moment came, when it cost him nothing to simply share the work fairly, he chose not to. That choice had weight. It always does, even when no one seems to be watching. Patrick Dunn spent years reading reports that described his hospitals from the outside in. He thought he was being objective. What he was actually doing was choosing a distance that felt like wisdom and wasn't. It took a letter written on lined notebook paper and 1 week of pushing a linen cart through the hallways of a building with his name on it to understand that the most important information in any organization lives with the people who have the least formal power to act on it. What changed him wasn't the bad behavior he witnessed. It was the good behavior he couldn't explain away. Hazel, holding a door, George, knowing the fastest route and waiting 14 years for someone to ask, the unsigned letter writer, trusting that the truth would travel if they sent it far enough. I think about the people in my own life who held doors I didn't notice, who knew things I didn't think to ask, who kept showing up with integrity intact in environments that were quietly asking them to trade it for something smaller. The story reminds me that how we treat people when nothing is at stake is actually when everything is at stake, because someone is always watching, even when that someone turns out to be the person who owns the building. And sometimes the door you hold open without thinking is the one that changes everything.